You know, usually when we talk about a military conquest, there is this ingrained expectation of total irreversible erasure.
Oh, definitely.
It is the tidal wave theory of history. I mean, an invading army sweeps in, they plant their flag, and the old civilization is just washed away.
Right, washed completely away.
You look at the map, and the borders are suddenly redrawn in a different color. The language spoken in the streets changes, the laws change, even the gods change.
It is a very binary way of looking at the past. We naturally want to categorize things into the conqueror and the conquered. It feels clean.
And it is an easy way to understand history, right? The Romans arrive, the Gauls are gone, the tidal wave washes the sandcastle away, and a new structure is built on the wet sand.
Yeah, that's the standard narrative.
But then, and this is why we are here today, you step into the world of Iranian history between the 11th and 16th centuries, and suddenly that tidal wave metaphor is completely shattered.
It really is.
We are looking at a historical landscape that defies almost every conventional rule of empire building.
The dynamic we see in this specific 500-year window is, frankly, entirely counterintuitive. It challenges our fundamental assumptions about power, culture, and survival.
It is the absolute definition of historical muddy waters. Welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive. Today, we are going on a sweeping 500-year roller coaster ride through the history of Persia.
It's going to be quite a ride.
And my mission for you, the listener, is to unpack a paradox that absolutely blew my mind when I started digging into the sources we have compiled. We are looking at a stack of historical text detailing wave after wave of some of the most terrifying, devastating, nomadic conquerors the world has ever seen.
Oh, absolutely brutal forces.
We are talking about the Seljuk Turks,
Yes.
the Mongols,
Oh.
Emir Timur, who is better known in the West as Tamerlane.
And these are not just armies that defeated other armies. I mean, these are forces that systematically leveled massive ancient cities to the bare earth.
But here is the massive aha moment we're going to explore today. How does a sedentary, settled civilization not just survive these repeated apocalypses, but actually absorb, assimilate, and eventually transform the very people who conquered them?
That is the big question.
Right, because this isn't just a timeline of kings and battles. It is a masterclass in administrative survival. It is the literal weaponization of culture.
And the sheer stubborn resilience required to pull that off over half a millennium is, well, it's staggering.
It really is.
So to really understand what we're talking about, I want to set the stage visually. I want you to imagine a vast, constantly morphing map. Picture Central Asia and the Middle East.
Okay, I've got the map in my head.
Way out on the right side of your mental map, in the distant east, you have the Altai Mountains. For centuries, this era is defined by a massive, seemingly unstoppable demographic shift.
Like a massive migration.
Exactly. It is the steady, continuous migration of Turkish nomadic tribes moving westward from those mountains across the steppes and pouring into the Iranian plateau.
And these aren't just, small, isolated raiding parties darting across the border to steal cattle, right? This is an entire demographic upheaval. Whole societies are packing up and moving.
That distinction is crucial. I mean, in earlier periods, say during the initial Arab conquests, Islam was introduced to the region, but it didn't fundamentally overwrite the demographic makeup of the Iranian hinterlands.
Right, the local people are mostly still there.
Yeah. Even when early Islamic caliphates utilized Turkish military slaves, who eventually gained political power, which, by the way, is how the Ghaznavid Empire formed, it was still mostly a circulation of individual military elites.
Okay.
But starting in the 11th century, the dam breaks. We see the mass migration of Turkish hordes.
Wow.
Entire nomadic societies, complete with their families, their massive herds of livestock, and their portable tent cities, are moving across the Oxus River, pushing into Transoxiana, and flooding into the settled agrarian landscape of Persia.
And what's so wild is that these invading nomads, who come in on horseback with composite bows and essentially take over everything by sheer, overwhelming force, they surprisingly end up becoming the greatest guardians and promoters of the very Persian culture they supposedly conquered.
It's one of the great ironies of history.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting in the early 11th century with the arrival of the Seljuk Turks.
The Seljuks are part of the larger Oghuz tribal groupings. By the time they arrive on the borders of the Iranian plateau, they have already converted to Sunni Islam.
Okay, caught it.
They are moving westward, searching for pasture and power, and they slam right into the Ghaznavid Empire. The Ghaznavids are a formidable power-controlling Khorasan, which is a massive, historically vital and incredibly wealthy province in eastern Persia.
And the Ghaznavids were not some minor regional player. I mean, they had an incredibly sophisticated military apparatus. They fielded war elephants imported from India. They had standing professional armies. So how on earth do these relatively decentralized nomadic Seljuks, led by two brothers named Togrul Beg and Chagri Beg, manage to just push a massive empire out of its most valuable province?
This is where our primary sources give us a truly fascinating, almost forensic insight into the psychology of conquest. We rely heavily here on the writings of Abul Fazl Beyhaqi.
Ah, Beyhaqi.
Yes, he wasn't an outsider looking in. He was a loyal state secretary and a highly placed historian within the Ghaznavid court itself. He was an eyewitness to the collapse of his own government.
Which is incredible to have that perspective.
It is, and Beyhaqi makes it painfully clear that the Ghaznavids didn't lose simply because the Seljuks had superior cavalry tactics or better archers. They lost because the internal rot of their own administration had completely alienated the population they were supposed to be protecting.
The anecdote about the governor-general of Khorasan is so revealing.
Oh, it really is.
The Ghaznavid ruler, Sultan Masood, appoints this governor who basically treats Khorasan less like a province to be administered and more like an ATM to be smashed open.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
He is plundering the local population, squeezing the merchants, taxing the farmers into total destitution, and then taking all that extorted wealth and shipping half of it back to the royal court in Ghazna to keep the Sultan happy.
And Sultan Masood is thrilled with this arrangement.
Yeah.
He views this as peak administrative efficiency.
Unbelievable.
Beyhaqi actually recounts a deeply frustrating conversation with a fellow courtier where Masood praises this corrupt, tyrannical governor. Masood calls him a good lackey and essentially says that if he just had a couple more officials as ruthlessly efficient as this guy, his chronic financial shortfalls would vanish overnight.
Which is the ultimate example of a ruler prioritizing short-term quarterly profits over the long-term survival of the company.
Precisely.
The courtier tells Beyhaqi, "I agreed with the king to his face, but I didn't have the guts to tell him the actual truth." And the truth was that the people of Khorasan, from the wealthy urban elites all the way down to the rural commoners, were being bled dry. They had zero loyalty left for the Ghaznavid state.
Beyhaqi explicitly notes that this systemic greed paved the way for their destruction. When the Seljuk brothers, Togrul and Chagri, finally force a massive confrontation with the Ghaznavid army at the Battle of Dandenquan in 1040, the Ghaznavids are routed.
Right.
And Beyhaqi, again a Ghaznavid official, admits that the Seljuks were essentially welcomed. They won with the tacit blessing and sometimes active support of the local population in Khorasan.
The locals looked at the terrifying unknown of a nomadic invasion and decided it was vastly preferable to their own corrupt government. I mean, that is a stunning indictment.
It really highlights how bad things had gotten.
So after securing Khorasan, the brothers split up. Chagri stays behind to manage the east, and Togrul Beg pushes west. He captures major cities like Ray, sweeps aside smaller regional dynasties, and in 1055 he rides his cavalry right through the gates of Baghdad.
Baghdad is the geopolitical center of gravity at this time. It is the seat of the Abbasid Caliph, who is the spiritual head of the Sunni Islamic world. But we have to understand that by 1055, the Caliph's actual tangible political power had been eroding for centuries. Prior to Tukral's arrival, Baghdad had essentially been a puppet state, controlled by the Buyids, a dynasty from northern Iran who happened to be Shiite.
So you had a Sunni caliph effectively held hostage by Shiite warlords.
Exactly. So when Togrul Beg, who is an aggressively orthodox Sunni, rides into Baghdad and dismantles the Buyid regime, the caliph views him as a savior.
He is the hero of the hour, restoring Sunni dominance to the capital.
Precisely. And as a reward for this deliverance, the caliph confers a highly significant formal title upon Togrul. He names him Sultan.
Now, I want to pause here because when a modern Western listener hears about a high religious leader placing a crown, so to speak, on a secular military leader, our minds almost automatically default to the European model.
Sure, that makes sense.
We think of the Pope crowning Charlemagne on Christmas Day. We envision this clean, theoretical division between the church, which handles souls, and the state, which handles swords. But looking at the sources, applying that European lens to the Abbasid Caliph and the Seljuk Sultan seems completely historically inaccurate.
It is a fundamentally flawed comparison.
Yeah.
The Islamic Caliphate simply does not map onto the Christian papacy. The caliph did not possess a papal-like doctrinal authority. He couldn't unilaterally dictate theology or excommunicate believers in the way a pope could.
Oh, interesting.
He was the symbolic political successor to the Prophet Muhammad. Conferring the title of Sultan on Tokral wasn't a philosophical move to create a separation of church and state. It was a pragmatic acknowledgement of sheer, unadulterated reality.
The reality of power.
Exactly. The caliph had the spiritual lineage, but the sultan had tens of thousands of mounted archers. The sultan possessed the independent executive monopoly on violence. By granting the title, the caliph was essentially putting a stamp of religious legitimacy on the absolute military dominance of the Seljuks.
So the Seljuks are now the undisputed, legitimate masters of a staggering amount of territory. We are talking about an empire that will eventually stretch from the borders of China in Central Asia all the way across the Iranian plateau into Iraq, and eventually pressing against the Byzantine Empire in Anatolia.
It's massive.
They are nomads who suddenly own one of the most complex, highly urbanized, economically intricate landscapes on the planet. The burning question is, how do you run a multi-ethnic, agrarian, and urban empire of that scale from the back of a horse?
The short answer is you don't.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And this is where we see the brilliant pragmatic symbiosis of the Seljuk era emerge. The Seljuks realized their limitations and effectively split the concept of governance into two distinct spheres.
Okay, let's hear about them.
On one side, you had the Sultan's Dargah. This translates roughly to the royal court, but it was highly mobile. The Sultan, his family, and his Turkish military elites did not suddenly move into stone palaces and become city dwellers.
They stayed in tents.
They maintained their nomadic lifestyle. They lived in massive, opulent tent cities that functioned as a rolling capital, constantly moving across the empire based on the seasons and military needs.
Because, keeping a massive standing army of nomadic cavalry in one place would instantly destroy the local ecology. They needed fresh pasture for tens of thousands of horses, and they also needed to project physical dominance by physically appearing in different provinces to remind everyone who was in charge.
Exactly the mechanism. At the Dargah, any aggrieved person theoretically had the right to approach the Sultan's tent and present a petition for justice. It was the nerve center of military command and the ultimate venue for executive decision-making.
Okay, so that's the military side.
Right. But to manage the actual mechanics of the empire, you had the second sphere, the divan.
The bureaucracy.
Yes. The day-to-day administration, the incredibly complex tax collection systems across different agricultural zones, the legal record-keeping, the logistics of supplying armies, all of that was handed over entirely to a pre-existing class of Persian bureaucrats.
So they outsourced it.
Basically. The Seljuks didn't try to reinvent the wheel. They adopted the ancient Persian administrative system wholesale. They employed Persian secretaries, highly trained tax accountants known as mostafis, and supreme administrators known as viziers.
Okay, let's look at this dynamic. It sounds almost exactly like a massive corporate merger where the flashy new CEO from the acquiring company realizes he hates being stuck in a boardroom.
That's a great analogy.
He prefers to work from a mobile luxury RV, traveling from site to site, focusing on hostile takeovers of rival companies. So to keep the actual business running, he retains the entire old mid-level management team in the glass skyscraper.
Precisely.
They handle the payroll, they handle the supply chains, they handle the HR, the nomads handle the fighting, the Persians handle the paperwork.
That corporate analogy captures the functional reality perfectly. The Seljuks had the martial prowess to conquer, but they possessed neither the inclination nor the specialized generational skills required to manage the incredibly complex agrarian and urban economy of Persia.
Right, it's a completely different skill set.
They recognized the efficiency of the Persian bureaucratic machine and essentially grafted themselves onto the very top of it.
But there is still a massive logistical hurdle. The Sultan has to pay this enormous nomadic army. Standing armies are expensive. And the sources detail this specific economic system they utilized called the ekta.
Ah, yes.
The ekta. It's a form of land assignment. The Sultan grants vast tracts of land, sometimes entire provinces, to his senior military commanders. The commanders are then responsible for collecting the local agricultural revenues, and they use those funds to pay, equip, and maintain their specific contingents of troops.
That's how it worked on paper.
Now, looking at this mechanism giving land to aristocratic soldiers to govern and extract wealth from, isn't that just a carbon copy of European feudalism?
It's a very common misconception because the surface mechanics look identical. You have a king, a warrior class, and peasants working the land to fund the warriors.
Right, sounds like feudalism.
But the underlying legal and philosophical framework makes it fundamentally different. In European feudalism, a lord literally owned his fiefdom. It was his property. When he died, it passed down to his son. This created a localized, entrenched nobility with a secure, multi-generational power base that could often challenge the king.
Security of tenure. The king couldn't just take the land back without a massive civil war.
Precisely. In the Iranian ecosystem, there was absolutely no security of tenure. The title to the land was never hereditary. The land always belonged to the state, which meant it belonged to the sultan.
Oh, wow. So no generational wealth.
Exactly. If you were a Turkish commander granted an eka, you were not being given the land itself. You were simply being assigned the right to collect the revenue generated by that land for a specific period. You held that assignment entirely at the pleasure of the sultan.
He could just fire you.
He could revoke it tomorrow. He could transfer you from a rich province in Persia to a hostile border zone in Anatolia the following week.
So you aren't a landed lord building a permanent castle for your descendants. You are essentially a glorified, heavily armed tax farmer on a temporary contract.
That is exactly how the central administration designed it, to prevent the military elite from putting down roots and becoming independent threats.
Smart.
Very smart. The only time an ekta holder could successfully pass the land to his children was when the central authority of the sultan became too weak to enforce the reassignments. And when that happened, the assignee wasn't acting as a loyal feudal vassal fulfilling a contract. He was acting as an independent rebel, actively carving out his own splinter kingdom.
Which actually perfectly explains the origin of the Khwarezm-Shah Empire.
It absolutely does.
The sources mention that the great Sultan Malik Shah granted the ekta of the province of Khwarezm to his favorite royal cupbearer, a man named Anushtagin. It was supposed to be a temporary revenue stream for a loyal servant.
Right, just a perk of the job.
But decades later, as the Seljuk central authority begins to crumble, Anushtagin's descendants stop sending revenue back to the center. They essentially say, well, we have the army, you are too weak to stop us, we're keeping this province permanently. And they found an entire rival empire.
They do. And we will definitely cross paths with them again because their subsequent geopolitical blunders bring about the end of the world.
They certainly do set the stage for catastrophe, but during the absolute peak of the Seljuk Empire, under Sultan Arslan and his successor Malik Shah, the central authority was terrifyingly strong.
Extremely strong.
And that centralized strength wasn't just due to military might. It was largely architected by one of the most famous, consequential figures in Iranian history, the supreme Persian vizier, Nizam al-Mulk.
Nizam al-Mulk is such a compelling historical archetype. He is the ultimate pragmatic Persian bureaucrat effectively running the Turkish military state. He is a deeply educated man of letters. He builds a massive network of colleges across the empire, famously the Nizamiye in Baghdad. He employs brilliant scientists like the poet and astronomer Omar Khayyam to institute a highly accurate solar calendar reform.
Incredible.
And crucially, he writes a classic defining manual on governance called the Siyasatnameh, or the Book of Government, which is essentially the rules for kings.
The Siyasatnameh is vital for us because it isn't just a dry administrative handbook. It reveals the deep underlying worldview of the Persian administrative elite.
It's very revealing.
Nizam al-Mulk had spent a lifetime observing a terrifying, seemingly unbreakable cycle in Iranian history. It was the cycle of arbitrary, unchecked rule leading to corruption, which inevitably triggers societal chaos and massive bloodshed.
Yes, a vicious cycle.
And that chaos only ever ends when a new, even stronger, even more ruthless, arbitrary ruler steps in to crush the disorder, starting the cycle all over again.
There is this one specific anecdote he includes in his book that really arrested me. It's about a ruler of Ghazna, and it brutally illustrates the true price of order in this society.
Oh, the baker story. Let's get into it.
So, there is a severe famine in the city. Wheat is scarce, bread is unaffordable. The starving poor go to the royal court begging for intervention, and they accuse the royal baker, a man with high connections, of artificially hoarding wheat and flour to drive up the prices and gouge the population.
It's a classic, terrifying crisis of urban management. Food riots can topple dynasties in a matter of days.
Right. So the king is presented with this crisis. He doesn't convene a trial. He doesn't set up an economic commission to investigate supply chains.
He doesn't hold a hearing.
Exactly. He simply orders his guards to seize the royal baker, throw him to the ground in the public square, and have him trampled under the foot of a massive war elephant. And then he has the baker's crushed, broken body hung from the elephant's tusk. They parade this incredibly gruesome display through the crowded streets of the town, with a royal herald marching ahead, shouting that any baker, who does not immediately open his shop and sell bread at a fair pre-famine price will receive the exact same treatment.
And the economic result of this display.
By that very evening, every single bakery in the city is fully open and overflowing with bread. The hoarding stops instantly.
I mean, I guess it's one way to solve it.
There is suddenly so much surplus bread available that there isn't even enough demand for it all. The systemic economic problem is solved in a matter of hours.
What is deeply fascinating here is the specific reason Nezam al-Mulk chooses to highlight this story.
Oh.
He isn't including it to condemn the king's extreme cruelty.
No, not at all.
He is illustrating the harsh, terrifying nature of what constitutes justice in a society where there are no established, institutionalized laws to handle complex economic crimes. In the modern world, we use regulations and courts. In the medieval Islamic world, in the absence of a comprehensive civic legal code, order is maintained almost exclusively through the real, visceral, or suspected threat of extreme, arbitrary violence from the supreme ruler.
It is the literal definition of order through terror. You don't hoard wheat because, with absolute certainty that the king might literally feed you to a war elephant without a second thought.
Right.
And it works perfectly in the short term, but it's an incredibly fragile structural system because it depends entirely on the personality, the willpower, and the physical presence of one individual ruler. If the king is weak, the bakers hoard.
And that fragility applies to everyone, no matter how high they rise. Even the brilliant, indispensable Nizam al-Mulk himself was not immune to the lethal whims of arbitrary power.
No one was immune.
He served as the supreme vizier for decades, practically running the day-to-day operations of the vast empire, while the Seljuk sultans were off fighting endless frontier wars. But eventually, he committed the one unforgivable mortal sin for a bureaucrat operating within this autocratic system.
He became too successful.
Yes. He got too rich, his network of patronage grew too wide, and he became too powerful.
Precisely. When Nizam al-Mulk reached the age of 80, after a lifetime of unparalleled service, Sultan Malik Shah unceremoniously dismissed him. The Sultan had grown intensely paranoid.
Understandably, maybe.
Well, he was surrounded by courtiers whispering that Nizam al-Mulk was acting more like an equal partner than a subservient employee, and that his sons and relatives controlled far too many vital government posts. The Sultan felt his absolute authority was being eclipsed by his own administrator.
And as the sources point out, with grim clarity, in this era of history, fallen viziers rarely survive their fall. Retiring quietly to a country estate to write your memoirs wasn't really a viable career path.
Sadly, no.
Shortly after he was stripped of his power, Nizam al-Mulk was assassinated while traveling with the royal camp. But it's the specific identity of his killer that violently shifts the trajectory of our history. Because he wasn't just killed by a random political rival or a mugger.
Right.
He fell victim to the dagger of a radical new splinter group that was about to permanently alter the concept of asymmetric warfare.
We are talking, of course, about the Ismailis, a group that is far more commonly known in Western popular history as the Assassins.
Okay, to understand who these people were and why they were killing viziers, we have to map out the religious landscape. The Seljuks, as we established, are militant Orthodox Sunnis. They view themselves as the defenders of the true faith.
Right.
But over in Egypt, you have a massive rival superpower, the Fatimid Caliphate. The Fatimids are Shiites, specifically a branch known as Sevener Shiites or Ismailis. They possess a completely different, highly esoteric theological doctrine that revolves around hidden meanings in the Quran and the spiritual significance of the number 7.
The Fatimids in Egypt were the great geopolitical and ideological rivals to the Seljuks and the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. They actively sent missionaries into Seljuk territory to convert people and destabilize the regime.
Like a shadow war.
Exactly. But in the late 11th century, a massive internal crisis fractures the Ismaili world. The Fatimid Caliph dies in Cairo, and there's a bitter, irreconcilable succession schism between his two sons, Mustali and Nizar.
And succession is always messy.
Always. The military establishment in Egypt backs the younger son, Mustali, and places him on the throne. But a very large, deeply committed faction of Ismailis believes the older brother, Nizar, is the true, divinely appointed imam.
And where are they located?
This pro-Nizar faction is particularly strong in the Persian territories. When Nizar is killed in Egypt, the Persian Ismailis completely sever their ties with the Fatimid regime in Cairo.
They essentially declare independence and form their own radical, localized movement. And the leader of this Persian Nizari faction is a man named Hassan Sabah. He is described as a brilliant, ascetic, incredibly tireless strategist.
He was a mastermind.
While Nizam al-Mulk's Seljuk state security apparatus is actively hunting him down, Hasan Sabah manages a masterstroke. In the year 1090, he successfully infiltrates and takes control of an impregnable mountain fortress called Alamut, situated high in the Alborz Mountains near Qazvin.
Securing Alamut is a strategic pivot point for the entire movement. It provides Hasan Sabah with a highly defensible physical sanctuary. From Alamut, he begins to architect a localized, stateless network of power right in the geographic heart of the Seljuk Empire.
Wow.
Over the following decades, the Persian Ismailis systematically build, buy, or conquer a whole network of these isolated mountain strongholds across Iran and eventually into Syria.
So they have this network of inaccessible castles, but they are vastly outnumbered. I mean, they don't have a massive standing army. They cannot possibly ride out onto the open plains and fight a conventional pitched battle against tens of thousands of heavily armored Seljuk Turkish cavalry. It would be suicide.
It would be over in a day.
So how does a small, isolated religious minority project enough power to terrify an empire?
By inventing a highly structured, ruthless strategy of asymmetric warfare. Hasan Sabah recognized that he couldn't defeat the Seljuk military machine head-on. But he didn't need to defeat the army. He only needed to paralyze the leadership.
Which is much more efficient.
Exactly. Instead of fielding armies, the Ismailis utilized targeted terror. They selected and rigorously trained deeply devoted individuals, or very small teams, to infiltrate the courts, the households, and the retinues of the highest-ranking Orthodox Sunni figures, sultans, top generals, prominent religious clerics, and supreme administrators like Nizam al-Mulk.
They would spend months, sometimes years, living in disguise, working their way into the inner circles of their targets, waiting for the perfect moment. And when they struck, they usually chose highly public places, like the Grand Mosque during Friday prayers, specifically to maximize the psychological shock and awe.
And the element that made them truly terrifying, the aspect that completely broke the morale of the Seljuk authorities, was the psychology of these specific operatives who were known as fidais, or devotees.
Let's talk about that because it's wild.
The Ismailis who carried out these killings operated with the absolute certainty that they were going to die. They planned their infiltrations, but they rarely planned an escape route.
Because they knew they wouldn't need one.
Right. They knew that once they struck their target in a crowded public space, they would be immediately captured and killed by the guards, often in the most excruciatingly painful, hideous manners imaginable. Yet they embraced this fate with complete, chilling indifference.
Which presents an impossible security puzzle. How do you deter a killer when your ultimate threat, gruesome execution, is exactly what the killer desires?
You can't.
But this leads us directly to the mythology, because I want to completely dismantle a story that almost everyone listening has probably heard. Whenever the assassins are mentioned in pop culture or casual history, there is this persistent, famous legend about how Hasan Sabah supposedly brainwashed his men to achieve this level of suicidal devotion.
Ah, yes. You were referring to the Marco Polo account.
Yes, the classic legend. The story goes that Hasan Sabah would secretly drug his young recruits heavily with hashish. While they were unconscious, he would transport them into this hidden, physically constructed paradise garden located in the valley behind Alamut, filled with literal rivers of wine, exotic foods, and beautiful women.
The whole 9 yards.
The recruits would wake up, experience this incredible sensory overload for a few days, and then be drugged again and brought back to the dreary fortress. Hasan Sabah would then tell them, "You have just tasted the literal divine paradise. If you go on this assassination mission and die, you will immediately wake up right back in that garden for all eternity."
It's an incredible story.
And supposedly, that is where the name assassins comes from, a corruption of hashashin, meaning users of hashish.
It is an incredibly cinematic story. It's evocative, it's exotic, and it is entirely demonstrably false. I am very glad we are addressing this, because looking at the actual contemporary historical sources from both the Ismailis themselves and their Orthodox Muslim enemies, there is absolutely zero historical foundation for the hashish and fake paradise theory.
Wait, I just want to be crystal clear. There is no truth to it at all. It's entirely fabricated.
Entirely fabricated. It is a classic Orientalist myth. The story was eagerly believed and subsequently popularized by European travelers and crusaders, who interacted with the Syrian branch of the Ismailis, referring to their leader by the direct translation, the Old Man of the Mountain, and brought these wild, embellished tales back to a gullible Europe.
But what about the name? If they weren't smoking hashish to get high before missions, why were they called hashashin?
The term Hashanshin was occasionally used in the text by their Orthodox Muslim enemies, but it was used as a derogatory socio-economic insult. It was essentially the medieval equivalent of calling them low-class, uneducated rabble or drug addicts.
Oh, so it was just a slur.
Exactly. It was a slur meant to delegitimize their religious movement, not a literal, factual description of their operational methodologies or their training program. From that Arabic insult, the Europeans misheard and coined the modern term assassin.
So if we throw out the drugs and the fake magical garden, how do we actually explain their psychology? How do you get a human being to calmly accept being tortured to death for a political assassination?
We don't need to invent magical gardens when history is full of secular and religious equivalents. To understand their mindset, look at the Japanese kamikaze pilots during the later stages of World War II, or modern politically motivated suicide bombers.
Right, ideology.
Yes. The driving force is not narcotics. It is intense, profoundly ingrained ideological and religious devotion to a cause. Safavid genuinely believed that the Orthodox Sunni authorities were corrupting the true faith, and that Ismaili Imam was the sole divinely guided leader on earth. By eliminating the enemies of the Imam, they believed they were performing a sacred cosmic duty that absolutely guaranteed their spiritual salvation in the afterlife. It was pure ideological devotion.
That makes them so much more formidable. It is the raw power of belief. They weren't tricked into dying, they volunteered for it out of conviction. And speaking of historical myths, there is another incredibly famous, colorful legend from this era that our sources specifically highlight as pure fiction.
The three schoolmates narrative.
Exactly. It's this widely circulated story that Omar Khayyam, the brilliant astronomer and poet we mentioned earlier, Nizam al-Mulk, the great vizier, and Hassan Saba, the founder of the assassins, were all childhood schoolmates in the city of Nishapur.
A very popular tale.
They supposedly made a solemn blood pact that whoever achieved greatness first would lift the other two up. The legend claims Nizam al-Mulk got the viziership, but grew jealous of Hassan Saba's superior intellect, deliberately disgraced him at court, and forced him into exile. And in bitter revenge, Hassan founded the assassins and specifically ordered his old friend's murder. It is literally a Shakespearean tragedy.
It is a beautifully constructed narrative arc, but chronological reality shatters it completely. The sources make it clear that these three men were from entirely different generations. Nizam al-Mulk was decades older than Hassan Saba. They could not possibly have been schoolmates.
Not even close.
Right. But the very existence and popularity of this myth is deeply instructive. It highlights how utterly traumatized Persian society was by the sudden, terrifying emergence of the Ismailis. The assassinations were so shocking, and the destruction of the natural political order so abrupt that the culture had to invent these dramatic, intimately connected backstories just to make sense of the chaos.
It's a psychological coping mechanism for a society under siege from within. And despite the Seljuks throwing the full weight of their massive military at the problem, launching siege after siege against Alamut and the other castles, they could never uproot them. The Ismailis were too entrenched, the terrain too difficult. It seemed like the assassins were a permanent, invincible fixture of the geopolitical landscape.
It would take an entirely new, completely unimaginable force, a literal tidal wave sweeping in from the distant east, to finally breach those mountain walls and systematically exterminate the Ismaili state.
Which shifts our timeline into the 13th century and brings us face to face with the Mongol Holocaust. To set the scene, the great Seljuk Empire eventually suffers the fate of all highly decentralized military states. It fragments. The central authority of the Sultan breaks down entirely. Remember our cupbearer, Unstegan, who was given the Ekta of Khwarez?
The man whose descendants decided to keep the province permanently.
Right. Those descendants take full advantage of the Seljuk collapse. They build their own massive independent state called the Khwarezm Shah Empire. And under the rule of Sultan Alauddin Muhammad, they expand at a truly dizzying pace.
Very rapidly.
They drive out rival dynasties in Afghanistan. They conquer massive swaths of central and eastern Persia. If you looked at a map in the year 1215, the Khwarezm Shah Empire looks like an unassailable superpower dominating the Islamic world.
But as our texts astutely point out, looking at a map can be highly deceptive. The foundational structure of this new empire was incredibly brittle. It had expanded far too rapidly, incorporating disparate, hostile populations without taking the time to build a cohesive administrative structure.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It was. This made it highly vulnerable, particularly on its eastern frontiers in Transoxiana. Compounding this structural weakness, Sultan Muhammad himself was an incredibly flawed leader. He was indecisive, prone to panic, and his authority was constantly being undermined by his own mother, Turkan Khatun, who commanded the loyalty of many of the Turkish military commanders and ran her own shadow government.
Wow, a shadow government run by his mom.
Yes. And on top of that, he had even managed to completely alienate the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, depriving himself of vital religious legitimacy.
So he is ruling a fragile, overextended glass house, he has internal political enemies, and he has alienated his international allies. And meanwhile, a storm of unprecedented magnitude is brewing just beyond his eastern borders.
Genghis Khan.
Yes, Genghis Khan, who most Western listeners know as Genghis Khan, has successfully united the fractured, warring Mongol and Turkic tribes of the steppe. He is a military genius of the highest order, an incredibly astute and pragmatic diplomat, and he has forged a terrifying, highly disciplined war machine that is currently occupied with a massive, brutal campaign conquering the Jin dynasty in northern China.
And this is where the inevitable clash of empires is initiated. But what is truly fascinating, and often overlooked, is that the very first contact between these two superpowers was not a violent Mongol raiding party.
Really?
Genghis Khan, ever the pragmatist, actually sends a diplomatic mission to Sultan Muhammad. He is seeking to establish peaceful relations and, crucially, to open up lucrative trade routes along the Silk Road. Now, he does phrase his letter somewhat patronizingly from the perspective of an Islamic monarch. He addresses the Sultan, stating that he views him as one of his own sons.
Which, to a man with Sultan Muhammad's fragile ego, must have been infuriating. He considers himself the supreme monarch of the Islamic world, the successor to Alexander the Great. He does not want to be addressed as a subordinate son by a pagan nomad from the steppes who lives in a felt tent.
It was certainly a diplomatic slight, intentional or not, but nonetheless it was a concrete offer of trade, not war. Following up on this, Genghis Khan dispatches a large, wealthy delegation of several hundred Muslim merchants, who are his subjects, to the border town of Otrar, located on the far eastern frontier of the Khwarezm Shah Empire.
And this specific moment at Otrar is the fatal pivot point of world history.
It really is.
The local Khwarezm governor of Otrar, a man named Inulchuk, detains these merchants. He looks at their wealth and he decides, or at least claims, that they must be Mongol spies, using trade as a cover to scout the defenses of the empire. So, with the tacit or explicit approval of Sultan Muhammad, he executes almost the entire delegation of merchants and confiscates all their highly valuable trade goods.
Just a massive blunder.
But unfortunately for the governor, one single merchant manages to escape the massacre. He flees across the steppe and makes it back to Genghis Khan's camp to report exactly what happened.
And Genghis Khan falls into an absolute terrifying rage. But even at this moment, he demonstrates his remarkable discipline. He doesn't immediately launch an invasion. He follows established international diplomatic protocols. He sends 3 ethereal envoys directly to Sultan Muhammad's court, demanding that the murderous governor of Otrar be handed over to the Mongols to face justice for the slaughtered merchants.
This is the moment where the Sultan has a chance to de-escalate. He could sacrifice a single corrupt governor to avoid war with a rising superpower.
So it was a smart play.
But what does he do? He executes one of the Mongol envoys, a lead diplomat, and he shaves the beards off the other 2, which is a massive cultural insult, and sends them back to Genghis Khan empty-handed.
It is arguably one of the single most catastrophic miscalculations in the history of human governance.
The Sultan didn't just insult a rival king. By slaughtering peaceful merchants and then executing an official diplomatic envoy, he aggressively violated the most sacred, foundational laws of nomadic hospitality and international trade. It's like he deliberately tripped an apocalyptic tripwire, practically sending a formal invitation for the destruction of his own kingdom.
That is precisely how Genghis Khan viewed it. It was an unforgivable breach of cosmic order. Upon receiving the mutilated survivors and the news of his murdered envoy, Genghis Khan immediately pauses his massive, highly successful campaigns in China. He turns his entire focus westward.
Uh-oh.
He mobilizes the full, terrifying might of the Mongol war machine, and in 1219, he unleashes the first Mongol invasion upon the Islamic world.
And the sheer scale of the horror that follows, well, the historical sources genuinely struggle to find the vocabulary to describe it. How do we differentiate the Mongol invasion from the previous nomadic incursions we've discussed, like the Seljuk Turks or the earlier Arab conquests?
The primary horrifying difference lies in the deliberate, systematic, and industrialized slaughter of civilian populations.
It wasn't just conquering.
No, When the Arabs conquered Iran centuries earlier, there were certainly massive battles and casualties, but their core objective was subjugation. They wanted a living population to tax. When the Seljuk Turks arrived, they caused relatively minimal destruction to the urban civilians because they already shared a similar Sunni Islamic culture and respected the established administrative frameworks.
Right.
But the Mongols, under Genghis Khan, operated on a completely different psychological and strategic protocol. They placed absolutely zero intrinsic value on the lives of populations that resisted them, and they utilized mass terror and total extermination as their primary strategic weapons of subjugation.
They weren't just taking over cities, they were erasing them. The sources mention contemporary reports of total urban annihilation. Massive, ancient centers of learning and trade in Khorasan, cities like Merv and Nishapur, which had populations well over 1 million people, were besieged, breached, and literally wiped off the map.
Just gone.
The accounts describe the Mongols forcing the entire population out onto the plains, separating the skilled artisans they wanted to enslave, and then systematically beheading everyone else, men, women, and children. They would then pile the skulls into massive pyramids as a warning to the next city.
Now, in the interest of historical rigor, we must note that many modern historians have deeply questioned the sheer scale of those casualty numbers. There are strong demographic arguments that the arid environment of those cities simply couldn't have mathematically supported populations that large in the 13th century, or that the traumatized historians were vastly exaggerating the numbers for dramatic effect.
That's a fair point.
But the specific texts we are relying on for this deep dive use figures compiled by men like Ala al-Din Jovani and Rashid al-Din, and their identities are crucial. These men were not anti-Mongol resistance fighters writing propaganda in exile. They were highly placed Persian grand viziers actively serving the later Mongol Ilkhan rulers.
So they were literally on the Mongol payroll. They had absolutely no political incentive to make their own bosses look like worse monsters than they actually were. If anything, you would expect them to sanitize the history.
Exactly the point. They had access to the internal tax registries and military logs. Let's look at a later, equally devastating example from the second major Mongol invasion, led by Genghis Khan's grandson, Hulagu Khan. In 1258, Hulagu besieged and completely sacked Baghdad, ending the Abbasid Caliphate forever.
That was a huge moment.
Huge. One contemporary historian puts the number of civilians massacred in Baghdad at 800,000. Hulagu Khan himself, in an extant letter written to the King of France boasting of his conquests, claimed that his army slaughtered over 200,000 people in the city.
Which, even if we take Hulagu's own modest boast, is 25% of the highest estimate. But as the text powerfully argues, let's play devil's advocate with the math. Even if we assume that every single historical casualty figure from every city sacked by Genghis and Hulagu was exaggerated by a factor of 75%, even if we conservatively take only 25% of the reported numbers, you are still looking at a demographic holocaust of unparalleled proportions in human history up to that point.
Yes.
The sheer volume of human life extinguished is staggering.
A contemporary historian from the era famously, and perhaps accurately, wrote that the country of Iran would not recover from the demographic and agricultural impact of the Mongol invasions even if 1,000 years were to pass. It was the absolute zenith of hard power.
And what is the ultimate fate of Sultan Muhammad, the man whose breathtaking arrogance initiated this apocalypse? He doesn't even have the courage to mount a serious unified defense. When the Mongol armies pour across the borders into Khorasan, routing his border garrisons, he completely panics.
He runs away.
He abandons his armies, flees desperately across northern Persia, constantly one step ahead of Mongol pursuit, and eventually dies of illness, dressed in rags, on a tiny, isolated island off the coast of the Caspian Sea. It is a pathetic end. But his son, Jalal al-Din, offers a totally different, almost cinematic narrative.
Jalal al-Din is an incredibly romantic, tragic, and highly polarizing figure in Iranian history. Unlike his father, he possessed immense personal courage, charisma, and undeniable martial prowess. But he completely lacked the grand strategic vision or the diplomatic tact required to actually organize a unified multi-state defense against the Mongols.
Right.
He spent years fighting desperate, brilliant, but ultimately doomed rearguard actions against Mongol detachments, constantly moving from the borders of India all the way to the Caucasus.
The text highlights this one incredibly cinematic moment that encapsulates his life. It takes place at the Indus River. Jalal al-Din has been cornered by the main body of Genghis Khan's forces. His army is shattered, his family is captured, the battle is decisively lost. There is absolutely no hope left. So what does he do?
This part is wild.
He mounts his favorite war horse, rides to the edge of a massive cliff overlooking the rushing waters of the Indus, and he literally jumps his horse off the cliff, plunging into the river to swim to the opposite bank and escape.
And the legend recorded in the Chronicles states that Genghis Khan himself had ridden up to the riverbank and was watching this unfold. And the Mongol warlord was so genuinely impressed by this sheer, unyielding act of martial defiance that he turned to his own sons, pointed at Jalal al-Din swimming away, and said, "An army needs a general like Jalal al-Din, and a father deserves a son like that."
That is high praise coming from the man dismantling your empire. But ultimately, Jalal al-Din's resistance is futile. He spends years alienating potential allies in the West and is eventually ambushed and killed by local tribesmen in the mountains of Kurdistan. The Mongols take total, undisputed control.
And the aftermath of that control is brutal.
Right. Now, following the second massive wave of invasion by Hulagu Khan in the 1250s, the one that destroyed Baghdad and finally wiped out the assassin strongholds in Alamut, the Mongols establish a permanent settled dynasty in Iran. They call it the Ilkhanate.
This period marks the incredibly painful transition from predatory, annihilating conquest to the arduous, complex reality of imperial settlement and daily administration. But the transition was brutal and highly extractive. The early Ilkhan rulers maintained their nomadic mindset. They viewed the sedentary Persian population not as citizens to be protected, but essentially as an occupied enemy force to be exploited.
That's not sustainable.
No, they had absolutely no interest in the long-term welfare of the peasantry or the maintenance of agricultural infrastructure. Their sole administrative goal was to milk their new subjects for as much physical wealth as possible through arbitrary, crushing taxation.
Which predictably causes the entire agrarian economy to completely collapse. The Persian peasants aren't stupid. They realize very quickly that if they work hard to grow crops and rebuild the irrigation canals, the Mongol tacklemen will just ride in, confiscate the entire harvest, and probably kill them in the process.
Right, why even bother?
So the peasants adopt the only rational survival strategy available. They abandon the farms, they flee into the mountains or the deserts, and hide whenever the government officials arrive. The Mongols designed an economic system that systematically killed the goose that laid the golden egg.
And this extractive short-sightedness creates perpetual, crippling financial crises for the Mongol state. Despite sitting on top of one of the historically wealthiest regions on Earth, the Ilkhans are constantly teetering on the verge of total bankruptcy because they have fundamentally destroyed the economic engine of their own empire.
Wow.
This culminates in a massive crisis during the reign of an Ilkhan named Gaikatu. The state treasury is completely empty, and the crisis is severely compounded by a devastating epidemic that wipes out a massive portion of the Mongols' own herds of cattle and horses.
And Gaikatu's vizier comes up with an incredibly radical idea to solve the debt crisis. He looks eastward to China, which is governed by the Yuan dynasty ruled by Kublai Khan, fellow Mongols. He notes that the Chinese have successfully implemented paper currency.
This is such a fascinating moment.
So the vizier pitches Gaikatu, hey, we are out of silver and gold, let's just print paper money here in Iran, force everyone to use it, and our debt problem is instantly solved. They introduce this paper currency called kher.
And it results in a catastrophic, almost instantaneous economic failure.
Let's dig into why. Why did paper money work in China but fail so spectacularly in 13th century Iran?
Because the vizier fundamentally misunderstood the mechanics of fiat currency. Paper money has no intrinsic value. It is essentially a promise. Its entire functionality relies on deep, unshakable public trust in the stability and the backing of the issuing central authority.
Ah, trust.
The Chinese had centuries of centralized bureaucratic tradition and a populace accustomed to state-managed economies. But in Iran, the Persian traders, the bazaar merchants, and the general population possessed absolutely zero trust in the Mongol Ilkhans. They viewed them as violent, unstable occupiers.
So they just didn't accept it.
Exactly. When the government tried to force them to trade valuable grain and silk for pieces of paper with Chinese characters printed on them, the merchants simply went on strike. They completely rejected the currency. They shuttered their shops, hid their goods, and refused to participate. The entire economy of the empire ground to a total halt within weeks. It was a disaster that led directly to Gaikatu being overthrown and murdered by his own cousin.
So the Mongols are failing spectacularly at the actual business of running a sedentary empire. Their economy is in ruins, their subjects hate them. But then in 1295, we see a monumental pivot. A ruler named Genghis Khan violently takes the throne.
Genghis Khan's reign represents the definitive moment of cultural assimilation. Up until 1295, the Mongol ruling elite in Iran had largely remained culturally distinct and isolated from the Muslim Persians they ruled. They had maintained their traditional steppe shamanist beliefs, or they converted to Buddhism or Nestorian Christianity. But upon taking the throne, Ghazan Khan publicly converts to Sunni Islam.
And because he is an absolute monarch, he brings the entire state apparatus with him. Islam is immediately restored as the official state religion of the empire.
This is a profound shift. This is the soft power of the conquered Persian Islamic culture finally beginning to reassert its dominance over the conquerors.
Right.
Ghazan Khan is highly pragmatic. He realizes that the extractive policies of his predecessors are driving the state toward total ruin.
So he actually listens to his advisors.
Heavily guided by his exceptionally brilliant Persian vizier, the historian Rashid al-Din, Ghazan institutes a massive, sweeping series of administrative and economic reforms. He aggressively curtails the arbitrary tax abuses, he tries to establish legal protections for the peasantry against roaming Mongol officials, and he standardizes weights and measures.
That's a huge step forward.
Crucially, he also reintroduces a modified version of the traditional Equus land assignment system to pay his armies, attempting to physically tie the nomadic Mongol soldiers closer to the settled agricultural rhythms of the land they occupy.
He's desperately trying to transform them from transient, predatory raiders into invested stakeholders in the success of the Iranian economy. Now, looking at this macro picture, there is this deeply bizarre, fascinating paradox. Throughout all this unimaginable bloodshed, through the massacres and the economic collapse, the Persian cultural output, specifically the arts and literature, does not die. In fact, some of the absolute greatest, most transcendent poets in the entire history of the Persian language are producing their masterpieces precisely while the Mongols are actively butchering people outside the city gates.
It is a stunning testament to cultural resilience. The poet Sa'di of Shiraz is perhaps the prime example of this era. He was a young man when the initial invasions began, and he wisely fled his native city of Shiraz, spending the next 30 years traveling extensively throughout the Middle East and North Africa to avoid the chaos.
Good move.
When he finally returns to Shiraz as an older man, he surveys the political landscape and mistakenly thinks the worst of the Mongol storm has passed. He writes a beautiful poem expressing hope, stating that the leopards had given up leopard-like behavior, believing that a new era of peace has finally arisen.
But he was entirely wrong, because he didn't know that Hulagu Khan's massive army was currently mobilizing and on its way to completely annihilate Baghdad.
Right. And upon witnessing the fall of Baghdad and the execution of the caliph, Sa'di ends up writing some of the most poignant, devastating elegies mourning the destruction of the Abbasid capital and the perceived end of the Islamic world order. But beyond his grand poetry, Sa'di's personal correspondence provides us with an incredible, microscopic window into exactly how Persian intellectuals survived, adapted, and navigated the lethal high-stakes politics of the Mongol Ilkhan courts.
This brings us to one of my absolute favorite anecdotes in the entire text. It is so revealing about the intense, localized patronage of the arts that somehow flourished amidst the ashes of the empire. So Sa'di is living in Shiraz, and he has cultivated a friendship with two of the most powerful men in the world, the Javani brothers, Shams al-Din and Atta Malik.
Very powerful men.
These men are the Persian grand viziers running the entire Mongol Empire. They wield unimaginable power, but as the text dryly notes, of the 9 grand viziers who served the Ilkhans, only one managed to die a natural death in his bed.
Right.
The rest were executed. So these brothers are living on a razor's edge. Their lives are in constant daily jeopardy.
The political stakes could not possibly be higher. A single misplaced word or jealous rival could result in their immediate execution.
So the elder brother, the vizier Shams al-Din, writes a letter to Sa'di in Shiraz, asking the great poet some deep philosophical and political questions. But he also wants to show off his wealth and patronage, so he includes a hidden financial gift. He dispatches 500 silver dinars to the poet.
Nice gift.
But adhering strictly to the complex rules of Persian courtly politeness, he doesn't vulgarly mention the exact monetary amount in the letter. He simply writes a self-deprecating note saying he is sending a very small, insignificant sum for feeding the chickens.
It is the ultimate aristocratic humble brag.
Exactly. But the courier, who is physically carrying the letter and the heavy silver from the capital in Tabriz all the way south to Shiraz, decides to skim some off the top. He literally decides to include himself among the vizier's chickens, as the text jokes. He stops in the city of Isfahan and uses 150 of the dinars to buy goods for his own personal trading business. So when he finally arrives in Shiraz, Sardi only receives 350 dinars.
Now, Sadi is an incredibly astute observer of human nature. He immediately senses that the money is short. But he is a master of etiquette. He cannot simply write a letter back to the supreme vizier of the Mongol Empire complaining about missing funds like a common merchant haggling in the bazaar. He uses his weapon, his literary genius.
He graciously accepts the 350 dinars, and he writes a brilliantly witty poem back to the vizier in Tabriz. The key couplet roughly translates to May, for every dinar you live 1 year, so you would live 350 years.
Which is an absolute masterstroke. On the surface, it is a highly polite, culturally appropriate prayer for the vizier's long life. But beneath the surface, it contains a highly precise, coded mathematical message. The vizier receives the poem, reads it, does the quick mental math, and immediately realizes, wait a minute, I explicitly sent 500 dinars. Why is the greatest poet in the empire specifically wishing me a 350-year life?
The vizier realizes he's been robbed. He immediately summons and violently questions the courier, who breaks down and confesses to embezzling the 150 dinars in Isfahan. And the story doesn't end there.
It gets better.
The other brother, Aytamelech Jovani, who is also a powerful vizier, hears about this incredibly elegant exchange. He wants to participate in this high-level cultural game. So he writes a massive letter of credit, instructing a prominent banker located down in Shiraz to pay Saidi an astronomical sum of 10,000 dinars as a reward for his wit.
But the logistics of medieval communication intervene. By the time the vizier's letter actually travels the hundreds of miles to Shiraz, the banker in question has unexpectedly died.
So Saidi writes back to the viziers again, entirely in flawless verse. He thanks Aytamelech profusely for his staggering generosity, but he writes, "The banker has passed away, and out of respect, I will not present this massive claim to his grieving estate and his orphans. I leave the money for his family."
And this specific act of unprompted grace, this public display of profound Persian cultural refinement and ethical superiority, completely enchants the ruthless Mongol viziers. Aytamelech is so deeply moved by Sadi's nobility that he issues an imperial order for 50,000 gold coins, a sum that could probably fund an entire army campaign to be physically transported to Sadi, explicitly begging the poet to use the vast fortune to build a magnificent, enduring guest house and theological center in Shiraz.
Which Safavid actually builds. The ruins of it became a major landmark. It's a breathtaking story when you pull back and look at the context. You have the entire known world burning down around them. Millions of people are dead. The agricultural economy is in absolute ruins. The political climate is murderously unstable. But right there, at the very highest echelons of government, the men running the Mongol war machine are enthusiastically exchanging witty poetry and dropping 50,000 gold coins just to win a battle of literary elegance.
It perfectly highlights the extreme, almost surreal localization of culture. The macro environment of the 13th century was a literal holocaust. But within the insulated micro-environments of the Persian vizier's courts, the ancient administrative and artistic culture not only survived, it actively commanded the awe, the respect, and the vast plundered wealth of the conquerors. The Mongols possessed the swords, but they desperately craved the cultural validation that only the Persians could provide.
Eventually, though, even the assimilated Ilkhanate crumbles. A later ruler, Abu Sa'id, dies young in 1335 without leaving a clear heir. And just like that, the unified Mongol Empire in Iran shatters into a dozen pieces. The map fragments into a chaotic, bloody mess of warring regional dynasties, the Jalarids in Baghdad, the Mosafarids in Shiraz, the Karts in Herat. It is a massive geopolitical power vacuum.
And history abhors a vacuum. That fragmentation sets the stage perfectly for the emergence of a conqueror who consciously modeled himself as the second coming of Genghis Khan, but who, in his operational methods, was arguably even more terrifying and senselessly cruel.
We're talking about Emir Timur, who was born near the great city of Samarkand in Central Asia in the mid-14th century. Most Western listeners know him by the corrupted name Tamerlane, which stems from Timur the Lame because he suffered severe arrow wounds in his youth that left him with a permanent limp and a paralyzed right arm.
Now, Timur's background is highly significant. Unlike Genghis Khan, who was a pagan outsider, Timur was born into a settled Islamic, Turkicized society. He was a Muslim.
Right.
But politically, he deeply revered and desperately sought to co-opt the terrifying legacy of the Mongol conquests. He loudly claimed direct descent from Genghis Khan's royal line, though modern historians find absolutely no genealogical evidence to support it. To legally solidify this fabricated legitimacy, he conquered his way to power and forced two women who were genuine blood descendants of Genghis Khan into marriage. This allowed him to officially adopt the prestigious title Guregan, which means son-in-law of the great Khan.
He is basically violently acquiring the brand equity of the ultimate world conqueror. But when you look at his actual military campaigns, the word that keeps coming to mind reading the sources is repetitive. He didn't operate like the Romans, who conquered a province, built roads, established a garrison, and integrated it into a massive economic system.
No, not at all.
Timur would conquer a region, completely destroy its defenses, massacre anyone who resisted, and then take his army and all the loot back home to Samarkand. And then, predictably, a few years later, when that devastated region inevitably rebelled or stopped paying tribute, he would march all the way back and destroy it all over again.
You've hit on the exact mechanism of what historians call the Timur paradox. When you analyze the early Arab caliphates, or even the later Mongols under Genghis Khan, you can identify a grand, cohesive architectural plan for long-term empire building. They wanted to draw stable borders, establish safe, taxable trade routes, and extract long-term sustainable agricultural revenue.
State building.
Right. Timur seemed to completely lack that structural state-building vision. His entire strategic philosophy seemed to revolve around ensuring that no rival power center anywhere in the world could ever coalesce and threaten him.
The text mentions an incident that is just stomach-churning: the city of Isfahan in central Iran. Timur conquers it and imposes unbearable financial levies. The desperate citizens inevitably rebel against his vicious tax collectors and kill a few of them. So Timur marches his army back to Isfahan, systematically breaches the city, and orders the deliberate mechanical slaughter of 70,000 men, women, and children. He then forces his soldiers to decapitate the corpses and build massive towers out of the 70,000 severed heads. It is just mass extermination as a pure terror tactic.
His military campaigns were geographically staggering. He campaigned deep into freezing Russia, where he systematically destroyed the power of the Mongol Golden Horde. He marched west into Anatolia and actually defeated and captured the Ottoman Sultan in battle. He marched south across the Hindu Kush and utterly sacked Delhi in India, massacring tens of thousands.
Unbelievable scope.
As a battlefield tactician, he was an undesirable, terrifying genius. He never lost a major battle. But he functioned primarily as an agent of chaotic death, spreading ruin across Eurasia, seemingly just for his own personal glorification.
So how do we conceptualize this guy? How do we explain his motivations? Imagine a ruthlessly aggressive corporate raider in the modern financial world. A billionaire who specializes in hostile takeovers.
I like this analogy.
But he doesn't actually want to run the companies he acquires. He violently liquidates them. He fires thousands of workers, completely strips the factories of all their valuable machinery, and then literally burns the buildings to the ground so no competitor can ever use them. But, and here's where the paradox kicks in, before he burns the headquarters down, he meticulously goes through the lobby and steals all the priceless original paintings.
Exactly.
He kidnaps the brilliant architects from their payroll, and he forcibly relocates them all to his own private, heavily guarded mansion in the Hamptons to build him a beautiful, serene botanical garden. It is maximum destructive economic extraction masquerading as high culture patronage.
That corporate raider analogy is the most accurate way to understand his relationship with his capital. That is exactly what he did with Samarkand. He systematically hoarded the finest artisans, the greatest scholars, the master weavers, and the unbelievable wealth plundered from across the entirety of Asia.
So he just takes it all back home.
Right. He forcibly marched them back to Samarkand to build him these breathtaking monumental mosques, palaces, and vast suburban garden complexes. And paradoxically, despite having rivers of Muslim blood on his hands from places like Isfahan and Damascus, he was an avid, enthusiastic patron of Sufi mystics, religious scholars, and Islamic architecture.
There is this legendary, highly symbolic encounter mentioned in the text that I think perfectly captures this bizarre, tense dynamic between Timur, the brutal conqueror, and the elegant Persian cultural elite he supposedly ruled over. It involves Hafiz, who is universally recognized as arguably the greatest lyric poet in the entire history of the Persian language, living down in the city of Shiraz.
Hafiz is a towering figure. His poetry is the absolute pinnacle of the Persian literary tradition.
Now, Hafiz had written a wildly popular, incredibly famous love poem long before Timur ever arrived. One of the key couplets in this poem translates roughly to, "If that Turk of Shiraz meets my wishes all, I will grant Samarkand and Bukhara for his black mole." He is using classic, exaggerated poetic imagery, saying he would happily trade the two greatest, wealthiest, most magnificent cities in the Eastern world just for a single, tiny beauty mark on the face of his beloved.
A beautiful standard hyperbolic trope in Persian romantic poetry.
Exactly. But the legend dictates that years later, when Timur violently conquers Shiraz and imposes a crushing financial tribute on the city, he specifically summons the elderly Hafiz to his court. And Timur is furious. He glares at the poet and says, "I've spent my entire life fighting, bleeding, and killing hundreds of thousands of people with my sword, specifically to conquer, enrich, and beautify my great capital cities of Samarkand and Bukhara. And you, a miserable, destitute beggar in a conquered city, claim in your arrogant poetry that you would just give them away for a mole on someone's cheek."
The world conqueror is demanding an explanation from a poet. And what is Hafiz's response?
Hafiz doesn't cower. He looks at Timur, points down at his own shabby, threadbare clothes, and replies with legendary, devastating wit. "Sire, it is precisely because of such reckless, prodigal generosity that I am now in such a state of poverty."
It is a phenomenal story. Now, chronologically and historically, did this exact conversation actually take place? It is highly unlikely. Hafiz was likely quite old or deceased by the time Timur fully controlled Shiraz. But its historical veracity is almost beside the point. The story survives and is repeated precisely because it perfectly illustrates the ultimate Persian cultural defense mechanism.
Yeah.
When a highly sophisticated sedentary culture is faced with overwhelming, terrifying, physically unstoppable hard power, their final, most effective response is wit, irony, and an absolute unshakable belief in the inherent superiority of their own cultural capital. Hafiz essentially disarms the terrifying world conqueror by making a self-deprecating joke about his own poverty, subtly pointing out that while Timur has swords, Hafiz has the power of the pen that will make him immortal.
Timur eventually dies in 1405. He is in his late 60s, caught in the middle of a freezing winter, actively planning to launch a massive invasion of Ming Dynasty China. And predictably, because he built a cult of personality rather than a stable administrative state, his death immediately triggers a massive, highly destructive series of civil wars and brutal fratricide among his sons and grandsons. But eventually, after years of chaos, his youngest son, Shahrukh, manages to consolidate control over a significant portion of Persia, ruling from his base in the city of Herat in modern-day Afghanistan.
And this transition ushers in a truly fascinating, relatively peaceful, and highly productive chapter known as the Timurid Artistic Renaissance. Shahrukh was a highly capable, pragmatic military leader, but he was fundamentally different from his father. He was not a bloodthirsty, restless conqueror. He wanted stability. And the true driving intellectual force behind this massive cultural flourishing in Herat wasn't actually Shahrukh himself, but his formidable wife, Garhashad Begum.
She is an absolute powerhouse of a historical figure.
Unquestionably, Garhashad and her brilliant sons, particularly Olo Beg and Basinkhor, actively transformed the Timurid court in Herat into the preeminent beacon of art, science, and literature in the Islamic world. Olo Beg was a legitimate world-class astronomer. He built a massive, cutting-edge observatory in Samarkand and compiled star charts that were used for centuries. His brother Basinkhor was an obsessive patron of the arts of the book. Under his direct supervision, calligraphy, bookbinding, and the incredibly intricate art of Persian miniature painting were elevated to their absolute historical pinnacles. And Garhashad herself was a massive patron of urban architecture. She commissioned incredible buildings. Her grand mosque complex in the city of Mashhad is still standing today, and it is universally recognized as one of the greatest, most beautiful architectural monuments of the entire period.
But as we have learned over the course of this deep dive, this is Iranian history in the turbulent 15th century. The golden eras never last. Shahrukh eventually dies of old age, and the fragile stability instantly shatters. Civil war erupts yet again. The brilliant astronomer King Olo Beg is overthrown and actually murdered on the orders of his own radicalized son. And most tragically, the brilliant, distinguished Garhashad Begum is executed by a rival Timurid prince during a succession struggle when she's over 80 years old.
With that internal bloodshed, the Timurid Empire rapidly fragments and loses almost all of its western territory. The geopolitical map devolves into chaos again, heavily dominated by two rival, fiercely militaristic Turkoman tribal confederations migrating in from eastern Anatolia, the Karakoyunlu, known as the Black Sheep Turkomans, and the Akoyunlu, the white sheep Turkmens.
So the map is an absolute shattered mess again. You have the formidable Uzbek confederations pushing down from the steppes into Transoxiana in the northeast, the remnants of the Timurids clinging to Herat in the east, and these fiercely warring white sheep and black sheep Turkoman tribes battling for supremacy across western Persia and the Iranian heartland. If you were an observer in the year 1490, it looks like a permanent, unbreakable state of chaotic, fragmented tribal warfare.
It looks completely hopeless. But beneath the surface of that chaotic tribal warfare, the seeds of an entirely new, incredibly potent, unified national identity are about to burst forth. Which brings us to our final breathtaking act, the Safavid climax.
The rise of the Safavids to create a unified Iranian state is, without exaggeration, one of the most astonishing, unpredictable political transformations in recorded history. Because they do not start out as kings, they aren't wealthy warlords, they start out as a small, ascetic, religious group.
Specifically, they originated in the late 13th century as a quietist Sunni Sufi order centered in the city of Ardabil, located in the mountainous region of northwestern Iran. The order was founded by a highly revered mystic named Sheikh Safi al-Din. And crucially, modern historical consensus, based on linguistic and geographical evidence, strongly suggests that Sheikh Safi al-Din and his immediate family were originally of Kurdish descent.
Wait. Let's hit the brakes here. A Sunni Sufi order of Kurdish descent. But everything I've ever read about the Safavid Empire in standard history books says that they were the ultimate foundational champions of militant Shiite Islam, and that their legitimacy stemmed from their claim to be direct blood descendants of the family of the Prophet Muhammad.
And this is exactly where we drop one of the most fascinating historiographical bombshells in the field. For literally centuries, the Safavid state produced mountains of lavishly funded, state-sponsored propaganda, official chronicles, and complex genealogical trees, claiming that they were direct, unbroken descendants of the 7th Twelver Shia Imam Musa al-Kazim. This genealogy was universally accepted as absolute historical fact by both their subjects and by historians for hundreds of years. But in the mid-20th century, an incredibly brilliant, rigorous Iranian scholar named Ahmad Khosravi decided to actually go into the archives and dig into the original pre-empire unaltered manuscripts.
Wait, so Khosravi goes into the archives, bypassing the state-sponsored propaganda, looking at these original handwritten documents from before they took power, and he must have found a massive discrepancy in the lineage tree, like a missing link to the Imam.
He found much more than a missing link. He proved conclusively, through painstaking textual analysis, that the entire Safavid lineage connecting them to the Shia imams was entirely retroactively fabricated. It was a calculated political myth constructed well after they gained imperial power to legally and theologically legitimize their absolute rule over a Shiite population. In their actual origins, they were Kurdish Sunni mystics.
That is incredible. Talk about aggressively rewriting your own history to fit the narrative. So how do these peaceful local Sunni mystics in Ardabil eventually transform into the founders of a massive, aggressively militant Shiite empire?
It doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah.
It takes over a century of gradual, radical evolution. Over generations, the order grows highly localized wealth and significant spiritual influence. But the radical shift occurs in the mid-15th century under the leadership of a man named Jonaid. Jonaid is deeply ambitious, and following a bitter internal family dispute over leadership, he is expelled from the sanctuary in Ardabil. He travels westward into eastern Anatolia, northern Syria, and in those rugged frontier regions, he begins actively recruiting deeply devoted, highly martial Turkoman tribesmen to his cause.
He takes a mystical movement and aggressively militarizes it.
Precisely. He fundamentally transforms the core nature of the movement from a peaceful, contemplative Sufi order into a fiercely extremist, heavily militarized religious cult. His Turkmen followers begin to view him not just as a spiritual guide, but they begin to claim actual divine attributes for him.
That's a huge shift.
It is. Jonaid makes brilliant political alliances. He allies with the powerful white sheep Turkomans, eventually marrying the sister of their supreme leader, Uzun Hasan. Armed with his fanatic followers, Jonaid launches aggressive holy wars into the Caucasus region against Christian enclaves, seeking plunder and glory. Ultimately, he is killed in battle.
His son, Haidar, takes over the leadership of the movement. And Haidar is a crucial foundational figure because he gives the movement its highly distinct visual tribal identity. He invents the Taj.
Yes. The Taj was a highly distinctive 12-gored red hat. The 12 gores specifically symbolize the 12 Shia imams, marking their definitive theological shift toward extremist Shiism. Haidar strictly mandates that all his Turkoman followers wear this specific headgear.
Which earns them their famous historical nickname, the Kazilbash, which translates literally from Turkish as the Redheads. The Kazilbash become the hyper-fanatical, utterly fearless military backbone of the entire Safavid movement. But Haidar, mirroring the fate of his father, is also eventually killed in a brutal battle against regional rivals.
Which leaves the entire leadership of this massive, heavily armed, fanatical, militarized religious cult resting on the shoulders of a young boy. After his father and his older brother are killed by their political enemies, the survival of the Safavid movement falls to a child named Ismail. To protect him from assassination, his followers spirit him away, and he finds safe refuge deep in the thick, inaccessible forests of Gilan, bordering the Caspian Sea.
And this period in hiding is where the ideological shift reaches its zenith. During his years in the forests of Gilan, the young Ismail is intensely nurtured, guarded, and strictly educated by radical Shiite tutors. He is the first Safavid leader to be deeply, fundamentally steeped in militant Shiite theology from childhood. And his Kizilbash followers, who view his survival as a miracle, view him with an almost terrifying divine reverence. They believe he is infallible, guided directly by God, perhaps even an incarnation of the divine.
So in 1499, at the astonishingly young age of 12, Ismail emerges from hiding. He rallies his red-hatted Turkoman warriors, who truly believe their 12-year-old leader is invincible and divine, and he immediately goes on the offensive. And his very first military move isn't some grand piece of calculated geopolitical statecraft to secure borders. It is a brutal, hyper-focused military campaign of pure, unadulterated blood revenge against the ruler of Shirvan, the specific man responsible for killing his father and grandfather.
He successfully destroys the Twelver Shia, and then he turns his fanatical army south, setting his sights on the fragmented, exhausted remnants of the White Sheep Empire. In 1501, Ismail achieves the impossible. He conquers the massive, wealthy capital city of Tabriz, and there the teenage mystic crowns himself Shah. He is the first monarch to successfully rule over a territorially unified Persia since the Arab invasions completely dismantled the Sasanian Empire nearly 9 centuries earlier.
And this is where we have to pause and absorb the sheer, incredible irony of the situation.
Let me make sure I have this straight because it is mind-bending. The ancient, glorious Persian Empire is finally restored, but it is resurrected by a family of originally Kurdish descent who started as peaceful Sunni mystics, whose power base is entirely composed of Turkish-speaking nomadic warriors wearing 12 gored red hats, and whose political legitimacy rests entirely on a completely fabricated, fictional lineage connecting them to an Arab Shiite imam.
That is the astonishing, highly complex reality of the Safavid triumph. And this raises an incredibly important philosophical question about the actual nature of national identity and historical state building. The Safavids did not win the throne of Iran by tapping into some dormant, romantic grassroots nostalgia for the ancient pre-Islamic Sasanian Empire. They didn't rally the peasants by reciting ancient Persian poetry or talking about restoring the glory of Cyrus the Great.
They won through sheer, overwhelming, charismatic religious extremism and raw, terrifying military power wielded by Turkish nomads.
Exactly. The conquest was completely devoid of Persian nationalism. But the genius lies in what happened immediately after the conquest. Once they had seized the supreme power, how do they secure it? How do you actually run an empire of that magnitude? They instantly pivoted right back to the old, reliable, indestructible Persian playbook. They actively adopted the ancient Persian administrative template. They revived the ancient pre-Islamic title of Shahanshah, King of Kings. They officially reestablished the concept of the protected kingdoms of Iran. They utilized the ancient cultural insignia of the lion and the sun on their banners.
And crucially, the most impactful decision of all, Ismail violently and strictly enforces Twelver Shiism as the mandatory official state religion of the empire. This single act gives Iran a highly distinct, unified, state-sponsored religious and political identity that brutally separates it from the massive Sunni Ottoman Empire expanding to their west and the hostile Sunni Uzbek confederations raiding from their east. They literally forge a brand new, modern Iranian national identity out of these wildly disparate, contradictory parts.
It is the ultimate historical synthesis. You have the aggressive, nomadic Turkish military power providing the muscle, the fiery, unifying religious ideology providing the divine justification, and the deep, enduring ancient bedrock of Persian administrative and cultural tradition providing the actual machinery of state survival.
This incredible synthesis brings us to the close of our deep dive. We have just traversed 500 years of some of the most violent, turbulent, and catastrophic history on the planet. We've seen the Iranian plateau continually invaded, conquered, and devastated by successive waves of terrifying nomadic forces. The Seljuks, the Mongols, the Timurids, the Turkoman tribal confederations. The land was systematically ravaged, the ancient cities were burned to ash, and millions of lives were extinguished.
And yet, despite half a millennium of apocalyptic hard power, the underlying Persian civilization, its language, and its administrative genius were not permanently erased.
Exactly. Instead of being washed away like a fragile sandcastle by the tidal wave, the civilization acted like a massive, indestructible sponge absorbing the ocean. The Persian administrative culture, the intricate divans, the brilliant viziers, the transcendent poetry, the philosophical frameworks of governance always survived the initial slaughter. It slowly absorbed the conquerors. It taught the illiterate warlords how to actually govern a state. It converted them to its religions, and ultimately, it outlasted every single one of them.
Which leads us with a profound, highly relevant final thought to mull over. Think critically about how we instinctively view power in the world today. We naturally tend to obsess over hard power, military might, devastating technological weapons, the sheer physical ability to destroy our enemies. The Mongols possessed the ultimate unrivaled hard power of their age. They were literally capable of wiping entire civilizations and millions of people off the map with terrifying efficiency.
But when you look at the long arc of history, in the end, it was the soft power of the conquered, bleeding people that actually dictated the future. It was their poets like Saadi and Hafiz, their accountants in the divan, their complex systems of bureaucratic governance, their cultural elegance that actually survived the fire and tamed the conquerors.
The sword violently built the empires, but the pen actually ruled them
Ow.
and ultimately outlived them. In your own life, or when you are observing modern global conflicts and political strategies, it is deeply worth asking, are we continually putting far too much faith in the sheer destructive capacity of the sword and completely underestimating the enduring, transformative, and ultimately victorious resilience of the pen?
That is an incredible, deeply challenging question to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this massive historical journey. I hope this deep dive into the sources has encouraged you to actively question the neat, surface-level myths of history, whether it's fake royal lineages or magical assassin gardens, and to keep seeking the fascinating, muddy, infinitely complex reality beneath. Keep exploring, keep questioning the narratives, and we'll see you next time.